Tonight, we do have a speaker here to talk about our Scotch-Irish immigration. And I think a lot of you know Scotch-Irish immigrants are really the heart of Macon County population and settlement. Peter Cook from the Mountain Heritage Center at Western Carolina University is going to make us more enlightened about our own past. So,
thank y'all for having me. Can y'all hear in the back? Okay, good. That's Mountain Heritage Center. Some of y'all probably visited Western and know that we were in another location. I've been at the Mountain Heritage Center for quite a while. I actually was hired in 1998 to work there. One of my job, I'm the educator, and one of my primary roles is to go out and work with school groups. And over the first couple of years, one of the schools I visited was this school. And in fact, I went to a classroom with a gentleman named Josh Lynch, who I believe got a promotion recently. As you all know, he's the superintendent of Macon County Schools. So just keep in mind that he has a real eye for the heritage of the region. It was always a pleasure coming to this school. More recently, I've been able to bring some of our summer camp programs here and meet some of the folks that are here at the school. And we did country dance here on the gym floor. So a lot of fun things, a lot of associations with this school over the years. But yeah, that's our home location now. We're in the Hunter Library building. We moved to the Hunter Library building about 8 years ago. For many years, we were down in the H.F. Robinson building, the big white building, right when you come onto campus. And we've been there since 1979. That's when the Mountain Heritage Center opened its doors. That's our main gallery space in the Hunter Library. Some of y'all visited this space. 2 years ago, we did a quilt exhibit that was quite successful. The quilt, you can probably just see the green one there. I wanted to highlight, I'm sorry I didn't make it a bigger picture. Let me get my collection record out here. Came to us from Helen and Porter Lambert. But they were folks who moved into the Hall Farm, which is not that far away. I believe it's the property adjacent to the Cowie Mountains. And myself and a colleague went over there when the Lamberts had purchased the property. And there was a number of things that were left behind, and they wanted a better home for them. So we received a number of quilts. We received a big loom, what people commonly refer to as a barn loom. A number of other things. Mr. Hall's Air Force uniform. He was in service shortly after World War II. So we've got things at our Mountain Heritage Center. We have close to 11,000 artifacts, and quite a number of them are indeed from Macon County. And, our space is not very big, so we try and do our best to show as much as we can and rotate our exhibits and things like that. We had a quilt exhibit about a year or so ago. This is our exhibit that's coming up. We're going to open it in May 6th, Shadows of Incarceration, the Cowie 19 story. And it's going to look at the building of the railroad in western North Carolina and the use of incarcerated labor. And it's particularly going to talk about an episode that some of y'all are probably familiar with. It took place near Dillsboro, where a bunch of men were building the tunnel where the train goes through on its way to Bryson City. And they were in a stockade camp situation on the Dillsboro side of the river, and every day to work on the tunnel, they were being boated across the Tuckasegee. One day in December in 1882, the river was high. The boat tipped, and 19 men drowned out of the 45 that were on the boat. We think they're buried in that area. We're not too worried about that, but we want to bring their stories to light, and we talk about the use of incarcerated labor at that point in North Carolina's history to build important things like the railroad, but at what cost? So you'll hear more about that story, and I do encourage y'all to come visit us. And yes, yeah, he did it. He's very interested in that story. We've been consulting with him so much. But it's also interesting, not Gary, but there's a lot of stories and myths that have built up. And the Great Smoky Mountain Railway is great about telling the story, but it's a dramatic story. And sometimes drama helps sell things. So we're actually trying to address some of the drama and some of the stories that have built up around that. But the main thing is we know the men's names, we know the hometowns they were from, we know the crimes which they committed, for which they were scooped up into the penal system. And then loaned out to a railroad company. So please come visit us. Okay, on to the main topic. Who are, oh, I can't read that right. Who are the Ulster Scots, the Scots-Irish, or the Scots-Irish? I think it's all sort of the same group of people, and some of that also may depend on where you live or what time period you're talking about, where you're coming from. Ulster Scots is maybe a term you would hear if you were in the British Isles. Scotch-Irish is actually a term that was used by some of the first American historians, George Bancroft, when people started writing American history in the late 1800s. It's also a term, once these folks got to America, how they wanted to differentiate themselves from the Irish, the Catholic Irish who were coming to America in the middle of the 1800s. Scots-Irish is a term we're using a bit more today. I think, honestly, any of those terms is fine. Some people have a hard time with using Scotch as associated to people. I think I've heard folks say Scot-Irish, too. So. Loves the outfit, right? Y'all heard of him before, right? King James? King James Bible? He was pretty significant individual. He had a lot of people working for him, doing a lot of interesting things. He was James VI of Scotland, and then he ascended to the throne in England, which covered Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland. And he was James I. Pretty important monarch. A lot of people pin the beginning of this story to why these people eventually came to America on him. Probably the effort to subdue Ireland, for England to dominate Ireland, goes back even further. Goes back to Cromwell, goes back to Elizabeth I, probably even before that. That's a picture of the British Isles, of course, and I've tried to highlight with some arrows where these folks moved originally. And this is an interesting differentiation. Most of these people originally were not from the uppermost northerly part of Scotland. They were not Highland Scots. They were Lowland Scots. And the idea, James I and his advisors, their idea was to move some of these Lowland Scots into Northern Ireland to help subdue Northern Ireland, to suppress the dominant Catholics, to put people into that area who would be kind of beholden to the English crown. That was the idea. And again, this wasn't necessarily his idea. Elizabeth I had tried it on a smaller scale. Again, these people are Lowland Scots, and that's a very different type of people than the people more Gaelic-speaking Highlanders. These people did not speak Gaelic. They spoke English. They were influenced very heavily by that guy. Y'all ever heard of him? Calvin, John Calvin, who comes along. If you look at the dates, 1509 to 1564. Can I go backwards? I can't go backwards. Yeah, he's just a generation before James I. So they're all right in there about the same time. A lot of, today's Protestantism can really be, I'm not a religious historian, but a lot of it can go back to him. So it influences Presbyterianism, influences eventually what becomes Methodism and Baptist faith. These are some scenes from an old exhibit we had. Some of y'all visited. We did an exhibit on the Scots-Irish as a Mountain Heritage Center. That was one of the things we actually hung our hat on. This is a semi-permanent exhibit looking at this group of migration, this group of people when they migrated to Western North Carolina. So some of this is from some murals we had in the exhibit, and we also mocked up a cabin to try and give some examples of what life was like in Ulster, in that section known today as Northern Ireland. They lived in stone cottages, they had thatched roofs. We actually hired a guy from Plymouth Plantation up in Massachusetts to come down and do the thatching. And oh my gosh, he didn't finish it. Well, we wanted to show sort of the rafters. Yeah, luckily we didn't have a rain situation to worry about since we were inside. We eventually had to tear that out because we started having mice living in there. They weren't, oddly enough, they weren't in the roof, they were in the walls. They were really thick stone walls, you may remember. So, these people were mostly When they moved over, they weren't necessarily landowners themselves. They were mostly tenant farmers. And within that tenant farmer life, there were a lot of restrictions. They couldn't necessarily cut down lots and lots of trees. They had to farm certain crops. They were kind of limited in what they could do. Dairy was a big thing, raising cattle, raising some crops like rye and barley. There was some distilling that went on, but it was rye and barley spirits. So they lived in that lifestyle. But the big thing a lot of them were involved in was this industry, the flax industry. What is flax? Anybody know what flax is? Linen. Ooh, it's bright. This one's more. Yeah. I'll pass around a few fun things. Since I'm the educator, we educate best when you can get your hands on stuff. If you can feel it, you'll learn it. You'll know it better than if you just listen to me. This is flax. This is, I believe this is retted flax. What they're doing is they're retting the flax. They've harvested the stalks, which grows about that high, and they're sticking them in a pond. And they're going to sit in the pond for weeks or months. And they're going to half rot. They're going to ret. And then they get hauled out. And then there's a bit more that goes on when we start this going around. It's flax, I promise. It's not hair. Here's some of the stems that have started to be broken. They get half broken by just the rotting, and then they're beaten on. People would have to beat on them, or they would use a mill, some sort of pre-industrial mill, and beat on it. And the inside of the stem is where all the fuzzy stuff is. And that's what you have to then comb out. Yeah, here it is. And I'll pass around some yarn. Some linen yarn. And then finished product. It's just a bag, but it's made out of linen. It's a very profitable industry. Back then, the big choices for fibers for making clothes were wool or linen. Cotton was not part of the picture at all. So this is softer, nicer, maybe more flexible than wool. Wool's a little warmer, but definitely itchy and scratchy. Do I have any wool? I've got a little wool. Just to pass around to feel the comparison. This is the wool. These photographs are obviously a bit more recent than the time we're talking about. We're talking about the 1600s into the 1700s. These pictures are obviously more recent, but they show some elements of this home industry that definitely continued into the 19th century. In the early to mid 1700s, people started leaving Northern Ireland and started coming to America. And there are quite a number of reasons for that. One is putting a bunch of Protestants in amongst a bunch of Catholics created strife. We still have that today, unfortunately. In fact, when landowners were moving people over and taking them in, they were supposed to build essentially fortified villages. They were building forts in the middle of the area of Ulster that they were supposedly trying to subdue or contain the population. But if you're building walls, you're not necessarily, it's not, I don't know, it doesn't seem very effective somehow. So there was strife. The flax industry could be pretty successful, but sometimes there would be economic downturns. So the economy would go like that, and it was just tough on people from time to time. And then America was kind of opening up. There was going to be opportunities for people to come to America. So this is a copy of an ad from a newspaper that was in Ulster, and I'll just read it real quick. It's really interesting. For Savannah in Georgia and Charlestown in South Carolina, The ship Waddell, burthen 450 tons, William Reed Master, will clear to sail the 10th of October next. Those who mean to take their passage as servants or passengers are to agree with Matthew Ray, blah, 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 blah. Okay. This vessel is not yet a year and a half old and allowed to be one of the completest belonging to Ireland, and the master is remarkable for treating passengers well. Those who would go may depend on the goodness of the provisions, and they shall receive the same usage from Mr. Cunningham on this occasion as they have always done. So it's going to be good food on ship, right? The master will have rum to sell on board at 3 shillings 9pence something per gallon. So yeah, let's go. That's kind of interesting to think about, because most of these people who are coming were probably going into some sort of indentured servitude relationship. Someone was paying for their passage across the Atlantic Ocean. And then when they got to America, they were going to work for that person for a series of years, sometimes up to 10 years, to work off their passage. So I'm not sure how much spare change it had for buying shots of rum on board the ship, but nevertheless, it's a good inducement. We did have this exhibit on the Scotch-Irish, and we often got flack because we didn't talk a whole lot about English, and especially we didn't talk a whole lot about the German-speaking people that were coming to North Carolina eventually at the same time. So that's just my slide that shows the rest of Europe. So I can put that aside. There were people coming from various German states to America at the same time, and many of them did make their way to Western North Carolina. And coming to America is interesting because it's sort of a newer trend in American history is to not look at what's only going on the land, but also to look at what's going on the ocean. And this is what's known as the Atlantic world. And the Atlantic world isn't North America with its boundaries. The Atlantic world is the Atlantic Ocean, with the boundaries being all the different countries where trade is taking place. Things are going from one continent to the other and back. Enslaved people are going from one point to another, and then maybe from that point to a third point. And things are coming from the colonies back to the mother country. So the Atlantic world is a really interesting concept when you think about it, just this whole triangle of stuff going on. When these people left Ireland, they probably actually took a very southerly route and sort of made a big arc to get to the 13 colonies. And that has to do with the way the winds in the Atlantic Ocean work. They work in a circle, with the Gulf Stream leaving the colonies and going a lot more straight up to Great Britain. This is one of my favorite things I do with school groups. Who likes the Titanic? The Titanic didn't have to do that. It could just go straight across. In fact, if you go a little bit further north, you kind of cut the distance, don't you? Problem is that sometimes there are icebergs up there. So for sailing vessels in the 1700s, this voyage could take anywhere up to 2 months to go across. And the hold of the ship may be the size of this auditorium, maybe half the size of this auditorium. And yes, we're not talking about enslaved people being shipped from Africa to America, but still it's kind of tight. The ships are a little bit bigger than the Mayflower, but not all that much bigger. People would travel as individuals, people would travel as families. Sometimes an individual would go on an indentured servitude relationship and start working in America, and then the family would follow. Sometimes whole communities would go. The image there is from more 19th century, it's showing from the Irish Catholic migration, but the mode was very similar. I'm sorry, the tombstone is really hard to read, so I will read that one for you, because you never know what could happen on a ship. And the lead title on the tombstone says, "Born in a ship in the year 1730. Born upon sea near the Pennsylvania shore. Lived in America until almost 80. Happy the man who has his sins forgiven by our Redeemer who now lives in heaven." So he did all right, right? 80. How old was that? 80. Don't worry about mom. So yeah, so the family left Ireland, and then by the time they got to Philadelphia, there was an addition. a wonderful view of Philadelphia where many of these folks came to, or migrated to. Edwin Tunis was an artist and author. He wrote a lot in the 1960s and early 1970s. He wrote a lot about colonial life. He did wonderful, wonderful drawings, wonderful sketches. We like to talk about Philadelphia, but as you saw from the newspaper advertisements, some people were coming into Charleston, some people were coming into Savannah, which was a very small town in the 1700s, only really just gotten started. North Carolina didn't really have any ports. The Outer Banks, the rivers, everything just doesn't really conspire for creating a nice port or harbor. Virginia didn't really have any either. So Philadelphia, up further north, New York Harbor, there were a lot of Scots-Irish people who went in that way. The point of this map, and you can just sort of see the arrows, was to show the generational travel that took place. This is following a group of people, a family known as the Patton family, who ended up in Asheville in the early 1800s. But it took a couple generations for them. They landed in Philadelphia. They worked off, the dad worked off the indentured servitude in the Philadelphia area. They moved further west. They got some land. And then they went down the Shenandoah Valley, what was known as the Great Wagon Road, which went all the way to Salem, today's Winston-Salem. And then they worked their way west into what became Buncombe County, Asheville. So and that's very familiar for a lot of people who came to western North Carolina. But there were people living here, right? Some of y'all may be familiar with this map. This was in a book that Barbara Duncan and Brett Riggs wrote a few years ago about Cherokee places here in western North Carolina. With this map in particular, they wanted to highlight a lot of the towns that were in existence right about 1700, right when this migration was starting. And it includes the lower towns down there into upstate South Carolina, includes the overhill towns, and then of course where we live. Just make out the middle towns, Niquosi, Shoah, Watauga, Iola, and look, there's Cowie. Just barely see it. Oh, I should get the pointer. Where's the pointer? Here we are. There's Cowie. Watauga. That's across from the airport, just up the road. Where I work, Tuckasegee is where the East LaPorte Park is, or just down from there. Cullowhee should be marked on here, but it wasn't. A bit more notion that Cullowhee was quite a substantial town, but it didn't make their map for some reason. That's okay. A lot of people living out here. But unfortunately, due to wars and treaties, tough treaties brought on by wars, Cherokee didn't. They picked the losing side in the American Revolution. They were on the winning side in the French and Indian War, and then they switched partway through, and they went on the losing side. So just a constant encroachment from white settlers to sort of push them all the way back up into this area. By the 1800s, by the time of removal, the Cherokee in western North Carolina were pretty much limited to the area, the Great Smoky Mountain area, essentially. So for settlers moving in, this may have been an idea of what their homestead looked like. I think part of my point, and also pointing out all those Native American villages, is that the settlers moving in weren't moving into a totally forested area. There was certainly a forest, but there were a lot of areas that were already partially cleared or all the way cleared because Native people had been living there for quite a while, cultivating and opening up the forest. This was one of the views of the mural we had that was in the old exhibit, and we were essentially following a fictional family. And the family had children. Unfortunately, one of the children had passed away on the way. So. We like talking a lot about the adaptations, too, that people had to make. What did they keep? What did they pick up as they moved to a new country? And one term we like talking about is called infield outfield, and that has to do with agriculture. The agriculture in lowland Scotland it was pretty cultivated, it was pretty open, so you could put fields, you could have sheep, you could have cattle. When they moved to Ulster, it was a lot more limited, apart from the tenant-farmer relationship. It was heavily forested, so they developed a practice called infield outfield. And around their house, they would do the infield farming, and that was highly cultivated crops every year, essentially a really big garden. The outfield is where they'd have more of the rye and the barley, and they'd have a patch with rye and barley for 2 or 3 years, and then they'd let that go, and they'd move over to another patch and cultivate that for a while. The infield was where they would spread manure. The outfield never received any manure. And when it didn't become productive, it wasn't as productive, they would just move on. And so they could practice that here in Appalachia too. You could have the farm, and you could have, close into the farm, you could have pretty heavy cultivation. And then further out, you might have crops for this year, this is corn, and then the next year you wouldn't do anything. You just let the animals run. And that was another aspect of agriculture, especially here in western North Carolina. They just let their animals go wherever they wanted. The milk cow would keep close, but the hogs and the cattle that you're going to use for meat, they can just go through the forest and go wherever you want. If you're going to have crops, you got to fence them in because you got to keep out your animals. If your animals go on your neighbor's property, that's okay because their animals are probably going to come onto your property. That's all right. You know, they're going to go over to his creek, and they're going to come over to your creek. So, and that was an accepted form of agriculture back then. Some transitions. And this doesn't really show it. It did actually show it in the back, but they let rye and barley go, and they picked up the crop that everybody grew around here, the crop they picked up from other settlers and from the Cherokee. And that's corn, of course. And some other crops that they could grow, they weren't used to growing in the old country, but sort of the classic three sisters that native people had been growing for thousands of years, the corn, beans, and squash. I'll pass around some beans. My leather britches. Yeah, they're getting really leathery. Nobody eat them. The corn's great to talk about because what do we get out of corn? Does everybody like to talk about? Moonshine, yeah. What's the practical reason for having moonshine? Transportation, yeah. You could reduce the bulk so much. Even on top of grinding it, you can reduce the bulk down, and you can still maintain or increase your profitability. So, yeah, moonshine was incredibly practical. It's that pesky thing with the taxes that's sort of creating a problem. Flax continued to be an important part of life, I guess. This is a very whimsical picture that was actually drawn before the Civil War, piece of artwork. Also gets the idea of communal work, so everybody can beat each other with the scutching knives. Those are the things you whack the flax with to break down the fibers. But it was no longer sort of a proto-industrial situation where they're making bulk quantities of flax and linen to send over to England. It's much more home use kind of thing. Another aspect they tried to keep as much as they could, it just got tougher out here on the frontier, was the level of education. These were very educated people when they were coming over. They had some schooling or schooling at home, and they tried their best to keep that. It just got a lot more challenging out on the frontier where people were so sparse and scattered out. This is some pages out of a copybook that was part of a young man's education. He was in a tutor relationship, and the tutor was giving him books to copy out of, and he was learning his mathematics, he was learning navigation, lots of different things. This was donated a few years ago by some folks down from, well, their descendant ended up in the Rutherford-Buncombe area, sort of on the eastern southeastern corner of Buncombe County, the Andersons. Yeah, their copybook is typified by massive doodling. That was my comment on that. That's a great example here of that. See, you can probably see some wonderful graphs, work, geometry, and then, oh, we got a ship floating on through. Yeah. It's really cool, and the penmanship's beautiful. Oh, look, a fish. What is that other thing? I'm not sure what that is. Oh, it's a pigeon. Yeah. It's really neat.
The one before that almost looked like a quilting pattern, too.
Yeah, the star. Yeah. It is, can't quite see it, but it's east, southeast, something. Yeah, it's doing that. There's southeast. There's south. But yeah, it's that star right there. These next set, I've got two. They're kind of neat because it's a way to track the migration, and it's tracking it by their Presbyterian faith. 1750, just starting to see a few. And this is where they have a different, there may not be quite a differentiation. These ones down here in this part of North Carolina, this is Highlanders coming in from their removal, from the failed Jacobite rebellion of the 1740s. Many of them came to North Carolina too, but they ended up in this section, sort of around Fayetteville and what Fort Bragg area today. In fact, on the Fort Bragg base proper, there are framed churches from the early 1800s that were Presbyterian, that were preserved by the Army. 1776, the time of the Revolution, starting to fill in the upcountry, and what we would think of today as in western Piedmont. The Cherokee remain a strong presence in the Revolution. It got so complicated, they had to draw lines. Again, in 1790, the Cherokee remained a presence. By 1800, it's a lot of churches. Presbyterianism was hard to keep, though. There was a demand, there was a requirement for an educated clergy, and again, on the frontier, that requirement was tough to maintain. Around 1800, there was also the rise of the Baptist faith and Methodists. We'll show this, though. We got our numbers goofed up on this, but number 5, Franklin Presbyterian Church, 1833, formed by missionary Reverend Christopher Bradshaw, now First Presbyterian Church in Franklin, right? Yep. And they still have an old structure from the 1830s, the brick structure, right beside the new congregation building. No more reason. Methodists were very organized. Very organized. They had a lot of people going around the countryside. And they divided up the region into, I have a lot of terminology for this that's escaping me right now, but they were very organized. And then every now and then they'd have camp meetings where they would try and gather people together and have very enthusiastic and emotional services and try and bring people to that faith. And it was very effective, very effective. And Presbyterian was kind of on the wane at the same time. The Baptists and the Methodists were working very hard. It was tough for Presbyterians to maintain their population. So a lot of the Scots-Irish transitioned from Presbyterianism into Methodist and Baptist. Just a couple of maps to show the growth of Western North Carolina at this time. This is 1833. That's Haywood County. That's Macon County. I think I got that right. No, I'm one off, sorry. That's Buncombe County. That's Haywood County. That's Macon County. That's Indian Territory. This is right at removal, right when the Trail of Tears is about to go. 1850, Things are a lot more settled, and the people's existence is not so hand-to-mouth. Farms are much more flourishing in this area, and there's a road coming through Macon County, and it goes on south, and now we have Cherokee County as well. There's Murphy. That's still Haywood County. This is right before Jackson County forms, carved out of Macon and Haywood. These roads become significant because they become the outlets as the farms develop and begin to have surplus. And like I said, the existence isn't so hand-to-mouth. You can start selling to the outside world more and develop some really strong trade. By before the Civil War, Western North Carolina was seen as kind of a breadbasket region for the rest of the South. A lot of that area was very dependent on the enslaved labor producing cash crops such as cotton and tobacco. So there wasn't as much food production going on, so Western North Carolina filled in a lot of that food. This is a road that's known as the Buncombe Turnpike or the Drover's Road, and it's kind of typical of several of the turnpikes that crisscross the region. It was used to get the surplus out. There's Asheville, and it went all the way from Greenville, Tennessee, all the way down to Greenville, South Carolina. And the drovers were the people who were driving the animals, the surplus turkeys, yes, hogs, cattle, horses, down to markets. And along the way, they would stop at drover stands, basically small taverns and hotels where their animals could be taken care of and they could be taken care of. Imagine walking all the way to Greenville, South Carolina with a herd of pigs. It'd be kind of wild. Possibly faster than the herd of turkeys. Interesting, you may be able to see just that. Much more recent image, of course, but this has always been an export from Western North Carolina. What is that? Ginseng. Yeah. That's why we don't have quite as much of it. Oh, I have to have another picture of the pig, too. Oh, except the one that died. Very sad. Interestingly, this is something that's happening in the same period before the Civil War. The region's become a lot more settled. There's been the in-migration of the Scots-Irish and the Germans and English people. Some are first generation, some are second and third generation. There's a few leaving, moving into new frontiers in Tennessee or down into the newly formed states of Alabama and Mississippi. But also people are starting to come into the region as tourists. They're leaving the hot climates of Savannah and Charleston to come into the upcountry or coming all the way to Asheville, maybe coming even further. There's the historic house in Cashiers, the Zachary Talbot House, that was built by people from the low country of South Carolina originally, before the Civil War. So that's starting to happen as well in this period. I think my point is that this area has never really been completely settled, like people came here and just stopped. No, there's always been transition. My former boss used to talk about Western North Carolina as kind of a cultural crossroads. It can be seen as very monochromatic in some ways, but it's not. It's never been that way. This was an artifact we still have. We haven't gotten rid of it. It's just too big to fit in our current quarters. It's our wagon. It's known as a Carolina wagon. It was built. This one was actually constructed in the mid-1800s in Salem, and it's a smaller version of a Conestoga, and it's small enough it can go on these mountain roads. And used for moving families, yes, but more likely used for moving goods back and forth. It was pretty cheap. I forget what it was. It was $18.80. I think it was $75 is what it cost. And we did one of those inflation meters on Google, and we came up with around $12,000. So, cost of a used car. You could have a wagon. It'd be awesome. And that's my final picture, to sort of talk about all these roads. I came across this one image of some road building. It's hard to see, but they're mules pulling scraper equipment, trying to improve roads. And this is early 1900s, so we were coming up almost to just about 100 years ago. And this is what they're using to make the roads better. I do have some other things to pass around. Actually, we could have the lights, if that'd be okay. Pete! Who said that?
I'm a Scotch dog.
Yeah, A for the day. It's Pete. What is Pete? It's like, it's not coal. Give it a million years, we'll have coal, right? It's pressed bog material, and you'll be able to see that as you pass it around. But they would cut it out in Ulster, in Scotland, in other places. Actually, in eastern North Carolina, they dig it out as fertilizer. It's where a bog used to be several thousand years prior. You dig it out and you dry it. It takes a while to dry, and then you can burn it. And it doesn't really burn with like a super flame or anything. It kind of more smolders, but that's what you got. And it's a tenant agreement that says you can't cut down the trees. This is what you're using to cook with and heat your homes. So way before I got to the Mountaineer Center, there was supposedly some poor graduate student who went to Ireland to borrow some artifacts for our exhibit, and he was given what became a suitcase for him to carry home, and it was full of peat. So that's what we had in our exhibit. It was a nice little fire, fake fire, and it was all this peat he brought back with his. So I just think it's hilarious. I didn't pass around the flaxseed, so I should pass that around too. And since we got the lights up, I'll also pass this around. One last transition to talk about when they came to America and they kept using flax and they were using wool. They started using different dyes here in America, and a lot of them were typified by some of the plants. Some plants they brought with them. Madder is an old world plant. Indigo is an African plant in origin, but some stuff was new, like walnuts, black walnuts to dye with, peaches, hickory. Just can't have boring looking cloth, can you? My sample doesn't have a lot of blues and greens on all of it. They're good on oranges. Here's some flaxseed. And I did want to pass around a shuttle that they would use to weave with. This is an old one that is from here in America. And you know, some things change, but we still have people weeding. There's folks weeding down the hallway, and they're using ones that are like this. It's remarkable. Yeah. And interestingly enough, another migration that took place in the late 1800s and early 1900s, people going down to work in the cotton mills. And in the cotton mills, they're not physically using this, the machines are doing this, but isn't that interesting? Yeah. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Oh, I will pass this around. It's quite a beast, and watch out, it's pretty sharp on that. So, old one. Machine one. And one last artifact I'll just pass around because it's a great mystery. You've never seen one of these before. I'll tell you after this. I won't make you drive home in suspense. I forgot my list of names. I was looking for it. I didn't find it. That's one way we still know there's indeed lots of Scots-Irish heritage in the region. The problem with names over the years is that there's so much overlap with English. So sometimes it's difficult just with the name to parse that out. And then names get modified. One great name that's over in Jackson County I know is Cave. That there's some caves here in Macon County, but that was originally McCabe. So it's been modified, shortened over the years. Robertson, Queen, lots of queens all around, right? Other names? Duncan. Hunter, yeah.
Galloway.
McDowell. Where's my, sorry, I go all the way back. It's so close. It's so close from Scotland to Ireland that indeed for hundreds, if not thousands of years, there's been people going back and forth. So those names are very common all in this area. Yeah.
They wanted there to be intermarriage, right? They wanted there to be intermarriage, or did it just happen?
I think they did, sort of. I think they wanted control. I think they just wanted a population in there that they knew they could do. Because they knew they were moving these people into the Catholic. I don't know if they had an expectation that those Catholics were going to convert. And there were some people in Scotland, of course, who were Catholic. It's just the ones they were working with, the ones were overwhelmingly Protestant.
So the West, the Scots-Irish were primarily Protestants, and the Catholics did not take part in that same immigration. So they stayed put, or they immigrated to other places?
They immigrated later. The large Irish migration really starts in the 1830s and picks up steam with the potato famine, 1840s. This migration of the Scotch-Irish is long and slow. It may involve as many as 200,000 people, but that's about it. And it takes place over the stretch of the 1700s. So beginning in the first 2 decades of the 1700s and continuing all the way past the American Revolution up into the 1780s and 1790s. So it's not like the Catholic migration, or the Irish migration, which is a whole lot of people leaving because of the famine. It was so hard on them, and the economy was just awful. So just coming to America, trying to make it work. Yeah.
Did more people go to Canada or America?
Probably America. But yeah, some did go to Canada.
It seemed like it was shorter discounts. It could be that
The first few years it wouldn't have worked because the French still had Canada. And I'm not sure how, I actually don't know if they were very accepting of that or not. I think they wanted people coming from the metropolitan France. I'm not sure if they were interested in people coming from other places. That's an interesting question. Yeah?
I had a question about migration in, you had said they came down the Great Wagon Road. Correct me if I'm wrong, but was there also migration coming in from not only Wilmington, but Cape Fear area?
Some, but that's more the Highlanders who
Okay.
landed there.
Okay.
There's some. The people who landed in Charleston were starting to build up into the upcountry. And by the time of the Revolution, that was real. The British thought there'd be more support, more loyalist support from those Scotch-Irish people, but that turned out maybe not to be quite the case, especially in the upcountry and then into western North Carolina.
Laura McDonald didn't help with that.
No, she's a Highlander.
Yeah.
Sorry. No Highlanders. I'm recording, I promise. Yeah.
All right, I have my room open tonight for the textile room, and I've got it set up for the kids that are coming on Wednesday. So I have some natural dye displays in there.
Super.
So if you guys would like to pop in before you leave, it's right down the hall on the right. And it's Cali Textiles, but I do have it all set up we have about 60 kids coming on Wednesday. So I've got it set up for them with the natural dyes and stuff.
We won't touch it.
Hmm?
Other questions?
So you mentioned that the Cherokee had retracted due to being on the wrong side, being the losers in the Revolutionary War. What was the Scots-Irish perspective towards the Cherokee? Were they actively driving them out as well, or taking advantage of the events that were happening to possess those lands? Because it would seem a tenant farmer would sort of intrinsically understand, that's somebody else's. What gave them, how did they participate in that?
One of the precipitating causes of the American Revolution is a line that was drawn across the Appalachian Mountains, known as the Proclamation of 1763. And it was after the French and Indian War, when the French had lost, and ostensibly everything west of the Appalachians and north up into Canada was supposed to be open for settlers, white settlers. But there was a recognition by the British that there were all these tribes in there, tribal people, tribal nations. And they wanted the white settlers to stay in the colonies and be productive for the colonies and, or for the mother country and produce goods, and then maybe we'll tax them as well. So they literally drew a line and said settlers are not supposed to go across the Appalachian. But settlers were starting to do that anyway, and sort of elbow their way in. I think that's a lot of it is they're just kind of being burly and obnoxious and kind of setting up. The Revolution, when's the Rutherford expedition? 1778? Someone help me out. Roughly a couple years into the American Revolution, there's a big expedition put on by a guy named General Rutherford, and he does basically a circuit of all the counties around here in what we think of as Western North Carolina. And he doesn't have any big battles, he doesn't kill a lot of people, he burns villages and he burns crops. And at the same time, it's about 2,000 guys. They're all scoping out where the best place to live is. So when the revolution's over and the Cherokee are forced to sign some treaties, like we lost, and we have to give up what became Buncombe County and retreat further west, then a lot of those people on the Rutherford expedition are able to come in and take some of that. The other way the American Army was paying people is not with money, because they didn't have any money, but with land. That's how the Continental Congress was getting people to be in the Patriot Army. Was we're going to do land when we win, and we can push the Indians back when we take over. So it's kind of being obnoxious. If you've ever come into Silva from Waynesville, past the hospital, there's a funky historic marker called the Meigs-Freeman line. And that was, yet again, another line that was drawn by treaty by some guy named Meigs-Freeman. It went all the way from the border of Tennessee through where the hospital is, all the way down to South Carolina. And west of the line was supposed to be Cherokee, and east of the line was open for settlers. And even within that, Cherokee were allowed to have reservations. They were allowed to have family property. And settlers could have family property in the basement. But it made the Cherokee uncomfortable. It was an uncomfortable situation. So they abandoned a lot of those reservations and sort of coalesced in what we think of today as the Swain County area. So I think really the answer is these settlers were obnoxious. And there wasn't like killings or anything I don't hear of. But I think they're just rude and tough to be neighbors with. That's not nice to hear about. I think that's how it went. That was a long answer. Other questions? Hey. Well, I'll stick around. If y'all got other questions you want to come chat with me, I'd be happy to have a conversation. Did anybody figure out what that thing is that's been floating around? What's that? It's a bullet mold, yes, very small mold. It's for probably bird shot. Patriot is a really sketchy movie, but I hear tell they melt down little lead soldiers when they use something like that. So, yeah. It's got some good points, right? Like many movies. Well, thank y'all very much for inviting me. It was wonderful.